And then so I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Nathan Fox. And Dr. Fox is a distinguished professor and interim chair at the Department of Human Development and Quantitative Methodology at the University of Maryland, College Park. And there is a bio of Dr. Fox in your little packet. And I'm sure that you're going to be able to tell a lot more about his work from what he's going to talk about with us over the next time period.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's really a privilege for me to be here. I appreciate the invitation that I got from Barbara Samuels to come and talk to you. Actually, this is a great setup for my for my talk, because what Sherilyn mentioned as part of what she thought was important is that you have data that you can use in your fight and in your advocacy. So that's what I'm here to give you. I'm here to present to you this morning what the science tells us about brain development and the effects of early experience on brain development. That's really the area of my research. I've been doing this research for some 25 years, and I work in a number of different settings, anywhere from I work in Bucharest, Romania with institutionalized children. I work in the foster care system in this state and in the state of Oregon, working with children who have experienced maltreatment and neglect. And we are interested in looking at the science, looking at the brain science to understand what the effects of early experience are. So in my very short period of time, I'm going to give you a primer, if you will, on what the science tells us. And then I added in a number of studies at the end of my talk that specifically address the issue of the effects of social class on brain development, because I think that that's important, and I think that that research is relatively recent, and so some of you may or may not be aware of it, but I think it's important in this very brief period of time that you hear about it. Okay, so let me start. By the way, I apologize, professor, have to use PowerPoint. It used to be that we had overheads, but now we have PowerPoint, which are actually movable overheads. Okay, so there are three core concepts that I'm going to be talking about very briefly. The first is that brain architecture, the wiring of the brain, is established early in life, and that early wiring supports lifelong learning, behavior, and health. Think about this as building a house. You start with a foundation, you set up the drywall, you do the wiring, and then you add all of the accessories and all the colors and the furniture and everything else that comes later. But first you have to have a very strong foundation. And that's really a concept and a principle in neuroscience, that brains are built from the bottom up, and that foundation starts early in life. The second is that stable, caring relationships, what I'm going to call serve and return, shape that foundation, shape brain architecture. And the third is that toxic stress, this is a term that you may have heard about, in the early years can in fact derail healthy development. So those are the three brain principles. And I'm going to illustrate that with some data from the neuroscience, from the brain sciences, to illustrate exactly what I mean by those principles. Okay, so first, experience builds brain architecture. We know that brains are built over time. Infants do not have the brains of an adolescent. We certainly hope not.
Thank God.
Right? And adolescence luckily is only a period of time, and most people mature out of it. And so there is lifelong brain learning and brain development, but The brain starts from a immature period and then wires up over time. Simple skills come first, more complex skills come later. Skill begets skill. And the second thing to know is that psychology and neuroscience often separated out intellectual from emotional development. But now we know that they're both intertwined. You really cannot understand development, either brain development or behavioral development, without understanding both emotional and cognitive development at the same time. And the second or third principle is that a strong foundation improves the odds of a positive or adaptive outcome as opposed to a weak foundation. Now let me give you some illustrations. It's one of my favorite figures, only because I find myself at the right-hand end of that. But you can see here is that the ability to change brain structure, plasticity in brain development, decreases over age. We can still be lifelong learners as we get older, but the ability to learn new things gets harder as we get older. I experience that every day. But the point is that it's easier. Their brain is more plastic at younger ages than it is at older ages. Conversely, the effort, the metabolism, the effort that is required to enhance neural connections gets larger as we get older. So I can try to learn tennis as an older adult, but if I had started as a youngster, I probably would have had a better foundation for the motor skills and the skills that are necessary in terms of understanding how to play that game. And it's true about lots of things. Language is a good example. Sports skills is a good example. It doesn't mean that as we get older that we can't learn these new things. It's just that it requires more effort and for the brain to wire up as we get older. But the other thing to know is that neural circuits are wired from the bottom up and in a sequence. The brain does not wire in every area at the same time. So if you scale and you look at the wiring of the brain, what you see is that the first thing that wires up during the first years of life, actually starting in utero and then in the first years of life, are the sensory pathways, vision and audition. And that increase that you see in that curve means that's the number, think about it that as the brain wiring, the number of synapses, if you will, that increase in the part of the brain that is responsible for the sensory systems. The next system that wires up is language. And you can see that that curve is moved over to the right. And what that means is that the learning period for language is more extended, and the information that is necessary for proper language learning occurs over a wider period of time than it does for visual and auditory systems. And finally, when we talk about higher cognitive functions, that's even a longer period of time for that wiring up. Now that's actually a positive message, because what it means is that for children, for young children, language learning really is taking place in the first 2 to 3 years of life. But learning other skills, what we call executive skills, that's taking place over a longer period of time during childhood. It's not all over in the first year of life. And so if I highlight the first year of life, you can see that the sensory periods, auditory and visual wiring, is taking place during that time. Language is very important, but these other skills actually are being wired up over a longer period of time during childhood. that brings me to a point about critical periods. You all hear about critical or sensitive periods. Those are windows of opportunity, if you will, when the brain is ready to receive information. And the way that that works, just very briefly from a neuroscience point of view, is that the synapses, the wiring in the brain, becomes more selective during these sensitive or critical periods of time. You can see that bottom figure where the branches of the neuron become more elaborate during the sensitive period of time. And I have an illustration for you. A very famous study that was done some 25 years ago by Bill Greeno, who's a neuroscientist at the University of Illinois. And he noticed that rodents were being raised in these isolated cages. And so what he did is he raised these rats in more elaborate environments. You see, he gave them places to run and jump and play, playground for the rats, if you will. And then what he did is he looked at their brains, and what he found, and you can see this just by the eye, is that the rats that lived in the isolated environments, their neurons were more impoverished than the rats that were raised in these more elaborate environments. It's really not an issue of impoverishment. It's really an issue of the natural environment. So what Greeno is really telling us is that the natural expected environment is one in which there are the opportunities to engage and interact in multiple different skills. That is what the brain is looking for early in life. Young children naturally reach out for interaction through babbling, facial expression, and gestures, and adults respond in kind. The metaphor that we use is serve and return. Again, back to sort of a tennis metaphor, right? You serve, the other person returns. The mom says something, the baby coos in return. The baby coos, the mom responds in return. That contingent responsivity is actually something that the human brain is looking for in the first years of life. And providing that provides the foundation for that wiring that I've already described to you and the development of these healthy circuits. Therefore, the systems that support the quality of relationships and care settings, not only in the family, but in the community, those are the things that support healthy brain architecture. Now, yesterday, John Powell actually set the stage. He talked about epigenetics. So I put in a couple of slides. I'm glad you're here, John, so you can see. I put in a couple of slides this morning about how experience actually changes gene expression. We have neurons in our brain, right? Those are the things that I've just been showing you, the actual cells in the brain which connect to each other via these synapses. And then what we have is genes that carry out instructions that tell our bodies how to work, right? There are chromosomes, you all heard about that, and inside the chromosome are the DNA, which is actually made up of these genes, which then provide the instructions to the body and to the brain to develop proteins which then are elaborated and create the different cells and different parts of the body. Now, early experience actually leaves a lasting chemical signature on the genes. So if you have a certain particular kind of early experience, it will actually modify proteins in the genes, and those modified proteins will either turn on or turn off certain genes in terms of their expression. So it's not that genes are deterministic. We used to think that, there was the old debate that we all remember, environment versus heredity. Well, the neuroscientists now understand that that is no longer the case. Genes are modifiable, and they're modifiable via experience. And in fact, we know that those modified experiences, those genes that are modified, are transmitted down across generations. So it's not as if they just remain in that particular individual, but they can actually be transferred across generations. Now, what are the barriers to educational achievement? Well, we know that they occur from very early on. This is a study that was published in 1995 by Hart and Risley. And I show this to you only because it's an older study, 20 years old now, and it shows that by 24 months of age, the vocabulary production of children from high SES families is accelerating at a faster rate than it is for low SES families. That study that Hart and Risley published has now been replicated in a paper that was just published last year in the journal Developmental Science by a group at Stanford, in which they found the exact same thing, which is that by 18 months of age, there are significant differences as a function of social class in number of words, in word production, and in language. Now, where's that coming from? Well, the Hart and Risley hypothesis was that it was language input that was the difference amongst the families. But there are other things which are also to be factored in to differences among children who are living in families in different kinds of environments. And particularly that has to do with the exposure to stress. So when we think about stress, we've divided stress into three different categories, if you will, what we call positive stress. Stress is not always a bad thing. When you have a certain amount of stress, it actually increases your heart rate and your arousal level, makes you a more efficient person in terms of your attention. Tolerable stress are stresses that you have that in the presence of an emotional or a relationship buffer that can be dealt with. But what many children and families experience is what we call toxic stress. We heard yesterday evening about the incredible amount of exposure to violence that some children experience and some families experience. That's what toxic stress is. And that has a significant effect upon the physiological, the stress system in the body and in the brain. Now we know that relationships buffer the effects of stress. Good relationships between a parent and a child, good relationships among individuals can actually be a buffer. But when toxic stress, when the stress system is activated chronically, it leads to significant health consequences. So let me give you some examples from the brain. Here's an example of two neurons, one from an animal that has been exposed to toxic stress and one from one that has not. And you can see the lack of elaboration of the neurons, of the dendrites between the two. And here, just to show you that a little bit more carefully, this is a neuron that's damaged by toxic stress. And you can see that it has many fewer connections, or the synapses, so that it can connect with other neurons in other parts of the brain. And what do we know about sources of toxic stress for young children? We know that maltreatment is a significant issue. We know, someone mentioned yesterday evening, postpartum or depression. Postpartum depression in moms is a significant source of toxic stress. And parental substance abuse, significant form of toxic stress. How do we measure stress, you might ask? Well, there's actually a stress hormone called cortisol. And there are individuals, this is from a paper that Gary Evans published some years ago, on differences in response of the stress system between middle income and low income children. And what you can see there is that the low income children have elevated stress hormones compared to those who are not. And that's both for cortisol and epinephrine, which are the two significant stress hormones in the body. And we know that the effects of this stress are lifelong. They're not just for children, but they have significant consequences for health over the course of the years. And there you can see the percent of adults who are at greater risk for heart disease. You can see that as you look for children who have experienced maltreatment and depression and maltreatment, that there's a significant 40% risk among those children for developing heart disease. This is an enormous burden upon the public health system in the United States. And I just put that up here just to show you how much money we are spending in the United States on healthcare costs as a function of the exposure to stress early in life. Okay, so just to finish this one part, the roots of health disparities, the roots of how adversity is built into the body is a function of exposure to toxic stress. This changes gene expression, it changes the stress system, and it results in changes in brain architecture. And so if we're going to prevent that, we have to reduce toxic stress in families, in the communities, to allow for healthy brain development. Okay, in my last piece, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about what we know now about the effects of a social class, SES, on brain development. The way social scientists generally measure that, there are a number of different ways: maternal education, occupation, but the findings are consistent across these different metrics of social class. And let me share just a couple of them with you. There are correlational studies. This is one that was done by Kim Noble and Martha Farah in New York City. They simply measured a number of different behavioral outcomes that were associated with different brain systems. They used parent education, occupation, and income as their measure of social class. And here's where they found. I can just tell you what it is that basically there were strong correlations between level of SES and performance by the children on these different measures. In fact, language was the strongest one. And if you look, I don't know if you can see this pretty well, but this is the effect sizes. And the dark bars are significant effect sizes as a function of social class in these areas. And you can see that language, for those of you social scientists, that's almost a 1.0 effect size, meaning that there are significant effects of social class on children's language performance. The other ones are memory, and working memory and cognitive control. So there are significant effects in these correlations, and they are consistent across studies. They're not uniform across these systems, but language tends to be the strongest one. Now, what about the brain imaging studies? There are actually two that I'm going to present very briefly to you, but I think that they show in dramatic fashion what the effects of SES are. This is a study that was done, oops, sorry, what happened? Sorry. Right, it was done by a group at the University of Wisconsin, just recently published, and it was a longitudinal brain imaging study of children from different SES level families. Here's what they found. You can just see, again, the ocular subjective method. It's an easy way of just looking at these graphs, right? You have three curves. The top curve are high SES, the middle curve is middle, and the one is low. And these are the trajectories of brain growth and development over age, from 5 months to 17 months, right? And you can see that that where they start out at 5 months with few differences, by 17 months of age, there are significant differences as a function of SES of the family. That's true for two important areas in the brain. The prefrontal cortex, which is all about learning and executive control, and the parietal cortex, which is all about spatial ability and motor control. And so in these two critical areas of the brain, living in a family from a low SES environment leads to a a slower trajectory of development and to a lower trajectory of development. You can see there, infants from low-income families had lower volumes, and the differences in brain growth are found to vary as a function of SES, with children from lower-income households having slower trajectories of growth during infancy and early childhood. A second study really closely was done with 10-year-old children, just dividing them up by their SES, and I won't go into the details, but only to show you, you can see again that there were strong correlations between the amount of brain development and the SES of the family, of these children. These were 10-year-old children. Low SES was associated with smaller volume of gray matter, of the cortical neurons in the brain, and also with less developed brains. And all of that is a function, we think, of the kind of stress that these families and these children are exposed to. Okay, let me finish with a couple of what we think are policy implications of this work. The first is that there are no magic bullets. We believe that positive relationships and quality learning experiences can be promoted both at home and through a range of evidence-based parent education, family support, early care education, and intervention services. And I think a comment was made yesterday evening that this is not just about the child or not just about the family, but it's also about the community. And I think that that's absolutely the case. There needs to be community support, not only for the family, but also for the children in that family. And the community can serve as a buffer for stress in the same way that the family can serve as a buffer for stress for children. A balanced approach to emotional, social, cognitive, and language development will obviously prepare children for success. And so science, the brain science, points to a two-tiered approach to reducing disparities. Better health services, good quality early care and education to promote healthy development and detect problems early in life, and targeted services for children experiencing tolerable or toxic stress that can reduce these disruptions to the nervous system and promote healthy learning and development. So with that, thank you very much.
Just 2 seconds. I'm Al Zachik. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist and work for Josh as the Children's Mental Health Director for the state. And Josh is a wonderful person. We're glad he gave us a few minutes because I know this was important for him. But with the legislature in session and all the demands on his time, he'll be involved, as he said, here representing him in the department. Just give you 2 seconds because I know we're a little bit behind time, but the concept sitting here listening with you this morning, last night, starting to meld some of our other services with what you all have done such a beautiful job with in terms of housing and changes and better environments, living environments for families. So critically important, but how do you weave, just one thought, some of the other services that we have available in the state. We have great home visiting programs. I've worked for many years to have a mental health consultation program to child care centers and Head Start, early Head Start programs around the state so that we're picking up the kids who are getting expelled. You all know that there is a statistic that more kids get expelled in preschool programs than they do from kindergarten through the 12th grade. Astounding, terrible, awful statistic, but you're bouncing around kids because their behavior is difficult from child care setting to child care setting and everybody feels terrible. Our mental health consultation program tries to stop that, and research has shown that a little simple intervention like that, children don't get bounced around, they get stabilized and they do well. Lots and lots of programs. We have a children's cabinet in the state where all the secretaries, and I represent Josh regularly on that cabinet, talk through policy with child welfare, juvenile justice, education, health, mental hygiene, budget. So there are places where I think can join your efforts in making sure that the services that we have available that we're working on, these broad state programs, link with some of what you all are doing. So I could talk lots about this. early childhood is near and dear to my heart, and got an award from the Academy of Childhood Psychiatry for our early childhood system of care program in the state, thanks to wonderful partners. So there's lots that we can do, I think, to help those families who do get the opportunity to move to better neighborhoods. But as we heard from the Urban Institute yesterday, just an astounding presentation, the families that are still in our tougher neighborhoods, and how do we help them, and how can we bring some of our services targeting, as was said last night. We could help with the public service side of things. We have lots of ties with the Department of Education, local school systems, making sure that those neighborhoods have better services. So anyway, 2 seconds for me. I couldn't help myself but say a couple of words. And we're here to work with you too from the mental health and behavioral health side. We're soon going to be a behavioral health department. I'll be in charge of substance abuse services for young people as well as mental health, overseeing them. So we've got lots, I think, that we can offer, and really want to join you. But I know there's probably a room full of questions, so we'll start at the table and go from here.
That was wonderful, thank you. We're very focused here on neighborhood, and I wonder if you could comment on the extent to which you've been able to isolate the effects of neighborhood specifically, as opposed to parental and other environments at different ages. And just a very quick observation here. So my assumption has always been that when the kids are youngest, they're affected most by their parents and by their immediate physical environment, like the actual structure. But as they get older, they get more and more influenced by their neighborhood, because they're sort of more and more exposed to what's going on in their neighborhood. But on the other hand, we heard here that a lot of really important brain development is happening in age 0 to 1, right? At which point it's possible that neighborhood matters a lot less than parental environment and physical immediate home environment. So I'm just curious, because we're all trying to figure out how important is it from a neuroscience point of view to move kids to other kinds of neighborhoods, and at what age? Is it really important at 0 to 1, or is it more important maybe to focus on kids who are a little bit older and are more likely to be affected by their neighborhood as opposed to their parental or their school or other kinds of environments?
So, I like your question for a number of reasons. So first, it's a great question, and second of all, I have no data to answer your question, so I feel free to speculate. I don't know there may in fact be research studies that have examined specifically the effects of neighborhood as opposed to SES, which are the studies that I'm familiar with on brain development. I don't know if those studies exist, but I could easily speculate and say as follows. There are a couple of things to say. First of all, most brain development is not over at age 1. So I didn't mean to give, if I gave that impression, I didn't mean to give that. It's extended over the early childhood period. And so the early childhood period, 0 to 6, is an incredibly important period for brain development. So that's just a correction for that. If I were to think about the effects of neighborhood, though, on infants and very young children, it would be easy, because for a couple of reasons. So first of all, if in fact the mom or the parents are directly interacting with the infant, then their experience and their stress is communicated to the infant. Their ability to care for their infant under the situations of chronic stress are going to decrease as a function of that neighborhood stress. That's the easy one. I would look even broader. I would say that everything from environment, that is the exposure to violence, or even the environmental situation of a particular neighborhood is going to have a direct effect upon infant and young child's brain development. We know, we used to think as neuroscientists and developmental psychologists that young children were not affected by stress and by traumatic events. We now know that while they may not remember those events, their stress system remembers. So that epigenetic example that I gave you is a good one, because while their memories, their actual memories for particular events may not remain, the epigenetic signature of their exposures to stress will remain. And so I would not want to say that exposure to toxic stress or to bad neighborhoods in infancy does not have as great an effect as it does for older children.
The brain matter development, the 15%, looked like it was about a 15% lag when you talked about the 17-month brain, your right or in front of those. Is that recoverable over time? Can the gray matter development catch back up to come in line with other treatments?
Yeah, I don't know that we have a, there's neurogenesis is throughout life, but neurogenesis meaning making new neurons, which is what gray matter is. The problem is that as we get older, the areas of the brain where neurogenesis occurs become smaller and smaller. So the areas of the brain where neurogenesis continues on through adulthood is in an area called the hippocampus, which is an area which is involved in learning and memory. But in areas like the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, which were what I showed you there, it's not clear that neurogenesis continues. Now that was only through 17 months, and as you saw in an earlier figure, there is brain development that occurs in those areas over an extended period of time during early childhood. But I don't know whether or not the loss of that gray matter or the lower amount, the smaller, slower trajectory of that gray matter is in fact irreversible. My gut feeling as a neuroscientist would be that if particular environments changed dramatically, that, I mean, we have a pretty plastic brain system in early childhood, and that the possibilities for that recovery are pretty good, but only during a particular sensitive period of time. Remember, I talked about that sort of sensitive period. I think there are periods of time when that recovery is more likely. It's also, if you remember that first figure, it's also with less energy and more plastic during those early childhood periods. Post that, it becomes more difficult.
Are there any international studies looking at the sorts of outcomes that you've been presenting, using class, but also looking as a prediction at safety net programs?
Well, that second set of data that I sort of whizzed by on social class, that was actually from, it was an international study. And there are studies in Europe that have demonstrated the same relation between social class and brain development. Studies in Canada.
Are there any interactional studies as well?
You mean between moms and kids?
No,
or?
Statistically interactional between the effect by class and the quantity or whatever safety net programs. I've read a little bit of this in health, but they're very general studies of cross-national differences in mortality.
You're right. So in terms of brain development, I don't know of any. Obviously, those are important studies to do, but I don't know of any myself that have actually had neuroscience outcomes along with behavioral outcomes in terms of intervention.
Sure.
I'm Dan Pontes from the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. I was just curious, all of the studies that I in the presentation had to do with socioeconomic status, and we're talking about the effect of neighborhood kind of independent of socioeconomic status, I think. And is there anything on that? You can kind of speculate that the stresses would go down.
Yeah.
Is there any? Has anyone ever looked at that?
So I did two things. One, because of the discussion yesterday evening, I went back to the papers that from the studies that I presented to see what the distribution of the racial distribution was, and it was not exclusively one versus another. There was a variation in racial characteristics of the subjects in all three of those studies, the correlation study and the two brain studies. But again, I know of no studies. There's Gary Evans' work, which has looked at the effects of stress as a function of neighborhood. But I don't know whether or not he has any direct measures of brain function or brain structure in that work. I don't think so.
Well, I only wanted to observe that given what you presented, which we were just kind of talking offline, suggests that this very early period is the critically important period for kids, and then in terms of the long-term investment and return, what you invest very early on actually will produce the greatest return, because the foundation, as you say, is the most important piece. And this seems like important information for parents to have in the context of making the kinds of choices that I was talking about, right? So very frequently parents think that, maybe what you were thinking, right, which is that what matters most when my kids are very young is me. So chaos may be happening in the neighborhood, which obviously is stressing me out, but I'm loving my child. And therefore, if I have the opportunity to move to a neighborhood of opportunity, what I'm really thinking about is moving when my kid is going to school, right? So I can really put it off.
Exactly.
And some of what you're suggesting is that, it might be that we want to give this kind of information to parents, that actually the time to get out of that stressed neighborhood is actually earlier than maybe we intuitively think, which is about getting our kid into a good school. And you may be thinking about middle school, or you're thinking about elementary school. But in fact, that early stress may be doing more damage, and that period may be more critical for moving out of that stress environment than later. So this is just one of those circumstances where, again, I think understand, the parents and bringing them into the array of information that you need to make the good choices. This suggests to me it's the kind of information that might be useful to fold in as you're presenting this option to parents of making these choices. Here's why you might want to make that choice early to move rather than make that choice later.
And I would just add to that, it would be really useful to get some better data, if we could, on the effect of neighborhood at different stages in people's lives, because I think your arguments are plausible, but it'd be wonderful to have a kind of the killer study that could show this.
Yeah. So someone asked Professor Powell last night a question about timing, which was really just exactly what your comment was about. And he gave a great answer, which is basically that dovetails with my presentation, which is that what we know from the brain science would argue that the period of early childhood is the period of greatest plasticity, but think about why are our brains as plastic as they are in early childhood? The answer is because we're learning so much, and because we are gaining so much from all of the experiences that we encounter. But there's another side to plasticity, which is that at the same time that we're gaining and wiring up with all of these good things, if we are exposed to negative things, it also has the most significant consequence. So for that reason, arguing that if you had choices, and there are always choices, I guess, that have to be made in terms of families moving, I would say yes, that the period of early childhood is the period of time that you would like kids and families to have that reduction in exposure to stress and availability of the kinds of resources that will build healthy brains and behavior.
One thought that just occurred to me while we were talking is, wow, maybe we can have a housing intervention with OBGYNs. If that's where we're seeing some real potential for difference. One idea. But the other thing I wanted to ask about, and this is really as a sort of housing advocate's perspective, thinking about the health side of things and recognizing that I can only guess at how hard it is to deal with health data and sort of extract information from that. So I'm understanding that. One thing I have found on the ground in Connecticut, working with the health data that's available through our Department of Public Health, is that the data is either set up by place, by race, or by income, and that it's almost impossible to sort of pull those things together and then break them apart.
So I guess it's really a comment, a thought about as we go forward working together, pushing from advocates to try to get the data set up in a way that can allow us to reach into it.
And if I would comment real quickly, our maternal and child health department in our State Department of Health, we have some of the federal money coming down to grow evidence-based practices on home visiting, and nurse-family partnerships and others start prenatally, which is where you got to start preconceptually to really start building a healthy environment for children to grow in. And they do some of that, but we mapped the state and looking at 18 sort of outcomes of infant birth weight, and like I won't have it at the top of my fingertips, but we can get some studies out to you. And the good young TA people who can, like IT, put these maps together, you see the hotspots in Maryland that talk about neighborhoods. Neighborhoods that have the worst, I hate to say it, but worst outcomes for children. And that's where we're focusing the federal money for home visiting programs. They're not surprises to people who know our state, are much poorer neighborhoods. So there is a way to use data to highlight neighborhoods that are not so good, and we're trying from a public health perspective to bring better public health services, as was spoken to last night, into those neighborhoods for those families who are there. I know you all have this wonderful, great, lots of research and work on moving families out of those neighborhoods. That's wonderful, but there still are families that live in those neighborhoods. And from a public health perspective, we're trying to bring better services to try to help get better outcomes there. So there is a way to use data to really focus your services, and we're doing that in Maryland. We also have a SAMHSA, Substance Mental Health Services Administration Project Launch Grant, which we helped get from our division, which is looking at Prince George's County and joining it with the county's efforts at their hotspots in 3 or 4 neighborhoods to bring early childhood mental health consultation and other services to those areas where we're not getting good outcomes. So I think we're doing some of that. I think there's ways to do even more of that.
Your comment triggered, as it often does these days, something that I forgot to say, which is that there is actually a study. There are a set of studies on neighborhoods. They're not with brain measures, but they're with health outcomes, and they were done by a group at the University of British Columbia. Clyde Hertzman was the person who directed that project. And what they looked at was neighborhood effects on child health and educational outcomes. And what they find is that and they have different metrics for describing neighborhoods, but they look at juvenile onset diabetes, obesity, and asthma. And they find increases in all 3 of these outcomes in children as a function of the lower quality neighborhood. So there you don't have the actual brain measure, but you do have tangible physiological health evidence for the negative effects of neighborhood or bad neighborhoods on children's health and development.
Children of similar socioeconomic status.
Yeah. Yes, and it was, and there's exactly, sorry, and it's children of similar socioeconomic status, right. So it cuts across as the Aspen looks at neighborhoods.
With the 3
Let's
juvenile
take Diane's
diabetes.
question and then
Juvenile
we'll-
diabetes, obesity, and asthma.
I don't have a question, I want to make a point to circle back to points that Joey made earlier in terms of the connection in terms of parents and children and the critical nature of not disconnecting that in the conversations in terms of this. Because basically, and when you talk about your earlier question in terms of the neighborhood, because there's not a disconnect in terms of the parent and experiencing the stress in terms of it is a conductor in terms of giving that off to the child. There's no disconnect to that. I mean, even if you try to keep the child in the house, regardless in terms of 0 to that parent is still a conductor for that. So all of those impacts that are happening to the child by virtue of that parent.
Right.
And so that's why that is critical. And that the other point I wanted to make though is relationship to that period of time is critical, but it's not the magic bullet that the brain development in terms of after you do develop and give that child options, the parent and family opportunity, that continued brain development for that child has to continue at different stages. And there's a lot more research, conversation about that now, as important as this period of time is. Let us not make the mistake of thinking that's a magic bullet and we don't have to do anything past that.
We agree.
So I want to do a full wrapping of the conversation for me around that, as well as more and more conversation around the impact of the toxic stress on the adult brain and what that does, even though there's less plasticity, that the brain is still developing and still has the ability to make some different choices. And to your earlier point as well about choices in terms of what that, so all of that becomes critical in using the data.
No, I think that's really two actually excellent points. First, we know that families are conduits, connectors to their children, and so to the extent that that families live in stressful environments, they are communicating that in their behavior or lack of behavior and interaction to their young children. So there's no doubt about that. The other is in terms of this lifelong plasticity. Absolutely, we would all, give up if we as neuroscientists thought that there wasn't the ability to maintain some plasticity over time and learning, and so that absolutely is true. The strong point that I'm making is that is two. One is that the energy that's necessary in order to have that learning be successful is greater and than it is at a younger age, and the return on the investment from an economic point of view is also greater with the investment at a younger age than it is at a later age. There's a Nobel Prize-winning economist by the name of James Heckman, who probably some of you or all of you have heard or know about, who has made this argument now for about 15 years about return on the investment. And I think that the brain science supports that